There was a time when not a single king ruled the earth. No crowns, no palaces, no thrones, no royal armies. Just small groups of humans trying to survive. Then somehow, humans made one of the biggest changes in their entire history. They decided that one person should have the power to rule everyone else. But why? Why would thousands of people agree to obey one person? Did they choose him? Did he force them? Or did he convince them that he was somehow meant to rule? And here's where the story gets even more interesting. The first king may not have started as a king at all. He may have started as a protector, a warrior, someone people depended on when danger appeared. But while protecting his people, he gained something far more powerful than a sword. He gained control over something everyone needed to survive, food. And the moment humans began producing and storing more food than they needed, they created something that would completely change the balance of power. Wealth. But how could a pile of grain eventually create a king? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a world where kings didn't exist at all. Thousands of years ago, human communities were nothing like the kingdoms we know from history. There were no giant cities ruled by kings, no massive palaces, no royal families passing crowns from one generation to the next. Most communities were relatively small, and people depended heavily on cooperation. If the group needed to hunt, the best hunter might take the lead. If they needed to travel, someone with knowledge of the land might guide them. If danger appeared, the strongest or most experienced fighters might organize the defense. But there was an important difference. Being a leader in one situation didn't necessarily mean having permanent authority over everyone. Once the hunt was over, the hunter didn't automatically become everyone's ruler. Once the danger disappeared, the warrior's authority could disappear with it. In other words, humans had leaders long before they had kings. But then something happened that changed the rules completely. Humans began settling down. They began farming. At first, farming may have seemed like a simple way to produce food, but it created a revolution. Instead of constantly searching for food, people could plant crops, harvest them, and store what they didn't immediately need. And that extra food changed everything. For the first time, a community could have a surplus. Imagine having enough grain not just for today, but for weeks, months, or even longer. That grain could be stored. It could be traded. It could be controlled. And once food could be controlled, wealth could be controlled too. Some families could accumulate more land, more animals, and more grain than others. Slowly, differences in wealth began creating differences in power. But wealth came with a dangerous problem. If one village had large food stores while another group had very little, those food stores became a target. Suddenly, protecting the harvest became just as important as producing it. Imagine a farming settlement at night. The fields are full of crops. Storage buildings are packed with grain. Animals are kept nearby. Families are sleeping inside their homes. Then, somewhere in the darkness, another group approaches. They know the village has food, they know the village has animals, and they know that taking those resources might be easier than producing them themselves. The alarm goes out. People grab whatever weapons they have, but someone has to organize them. Someone has to decide where to stand. Someone has to tell people when to attack and when to retreat. And perhaps there is one person who is particularly good at this. Maybe he has fought before. Maybe he is fearless under pressure. Maybe people trust him, so they follow his orders. The village survives. And then it happens again. Another attack. Another victory. Another reason to trust the same leader. Yesterday, he was simply a warrior. Today, people are asking him what to do. And that simple question, what should we do, can be the beginning of political power. But now comes the real problem. What happens when the war is over? The enemy has been defeated. The village is safe. The fields are growing again. Why should everyone continue obeying the warrior? If his authority only exists during an emergency, then his power could disappear as soon as the emergency ends. So if he wanted to remain powerful, he needed something more than military strength. He needed people to believe that his authority was legitimate. And this is where one of the most powerful forces in ancient society enters the story: religion. Imagine a massive ancient temple rising above a growing settlement. People gather around it. Religious ceremonies take place. Priests speak about the gods. And standing at the center of this world is the ruler. Now imagine the difference between saying, "Obey me because I have the strongest army," and saying, "My authority has the support of the gods." The second message is much more powerful. It transforms political authority into something sacred. The ruler is no longer simply a successful warrior. He can present himself as someone chosen, protected, or favored by divine powers. And when religion, government, wealth, and military power begin working together, something new starts to appear. The ruler is no longer just a person. He becomes the center of an entire system. But there was still one problem that every ruler eventually had to face: death. What happens when the king dies? Imagine a powerful ruler who has spent decades building his authority. He controls resources, he commands soldiers, people recognize his position. But one day, he is gone. If the entire system depends on one person, everything could collapse. A powerful general might challenge the throne. Another family might claim the right to rule. Different groups could fight for control, so rulers needed a way to make power continue even after they were gone. And one solution was incredibly simple. Make the next ruler a member of the same family. The king's son becomes the next king, then his son. Suddenly, the ruler's death doesn't mean the end of his authority. The power continues through his bloodline. Father, son, grandson. And this is where hereditary rule and dynasties become so important. Power was no longer simply something a person possessed. It could become something a family inherited. But even a king couldn't rule an entire kingdom alone. Think about everything that had to be controlled. Food had to be collected and stored. Taxes had to be gathered. Soldiers had to be supplied. Laws had to be enforced. Buildings had to be constructed. Religious ceremonies had to be organized. Records had to be kept. Messages had to travel from the ruler to distant communities. So around the king, an entire network of people began to appear. Officials, soldiers, priests, scribes, administrators, workers. Each person had a role in maintaining the system, and this may have been one of the most important developments of all. The king was no longer simply one powerful man standing above everyone else. The kingship itself had become an institution, a system that could survive the death of an individual ruler. And now we can finally see the bigger picture. The first king probably didn't appear because one morning humanity suddenly decided it wanted kings. Kingship developed through a chain of changes. Farming settled people in permanent communities. Permanent communities created stored resources. Stored resources created wealth. Wealth created something worth protecting. Protection gave military leaders greater authority. Authority needed legitimacy. Religion could help provide that legitimacy, and eventually hereditary succession allowed power to move from one generation to the next. A warrior became a leader became a ruler became a king, and eventually that king became part of a dynasty. So the first king wasn't necessarily the strongest man in the world. He wasn't simply the person with the biggest weapon. The real power came from something much more complicated. He controlled resources. He had followers. He could organize force. His authority could be supported by religion. And eventually, a system existed that could carry his power beyond his own lifetime. But there's still one question left. Who was the first king we actually know by name? Not a legendary character, not a story passed down for thousands of years, a ruler whose name was actually recorded. Where did he rule? What kind of world did he live in? And how can we possibly know anything about a person who lived thousands of years ago? The answer takes us to one of the oldest civilizations ever known, ancient Mesopotamia. And buried beneath the ruins of its ancient cities are some of the earliest records of kings, wars, temples, and power. Because the story of the first king isn't just the story of one man. It's the story of how humans went from small communities to cities, from cities to states, and eventually to kingdoms that would shape the world for thousands of years.